If you want to understand why the same corporations keep dominating the global economy decade after decade, you don't start in Silicon Valley, you don't start on Wall Street, you don't even start in Washington. You start in 1930 seconds, Germany, inside boardrooms, where some of the world's largest companies made decisions that would shape not only the war, but the entire economic architecture of the next 100 years. Here's the uncomfortable truth almost no one talks about. Many of the biggest, richest, most influential corporations alive today didn't just survive World War II, they grew because of it. They expanded through it. They reorganized after it. And in some cases, they helped design the post-war world we all live in now. The story of World War II is usually told through generals, nations, battles, and ideologies. But behind every tank factory, every oil shipment, every piece of machinery, every communication system, there were corporations, the silent giants, who built the infrastructure of global war and then repurposed it into global dominance. To understand how they became so powerful, you have to understand one thing. Wars end, but supply chains don't. Once a corporation becomes essential during wartime, it often becomes untouchable afterward. And the moment peace arrives, the same factories, technologies, patents, and networks simply shift from military use to civilian markets. Money never stops moving. It simply changes direction. Germany's industrial machine was not powered just by ideology. It was powered by corporate engineering. Pre-war Germany had some of the most advanced chemical companies, automotive firms, steel producers, and industrial conglomerates in the world. And when the Nazi regime needed to build an army, those firms were ready. They built engines, explosives, synthetic fuels, radios, optics, aircraft parts, medical chemicals, and machinery. They supplied not only Germany but in indirect, complex ways many of the countries that later fought Germany. Global trade is messy like that. But what's even more surprising is what happened after the war. Most people assume these companies would have been dismantled, punished, or erased from history. And some were investigated, fined, or broken up on paper. But in practice, many of them restructured, rebranded, merged, or quietly returned under new management. The world needed industrial capacity, and these firms had it. Their expertise was too valuable, their infrastructure too massive, and their networks too deeply woven into global supply chains to simply disappear. If you've ever wondered why European and American corporations dominate chemicals, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, engineering, and heavy industry, this is the answer. Wartime necessity created a corporate class that no government could easily control or kill. After 1945, the world had a different problem: rebuilding an entire planet. Bridges, factories, roads, hospitals, power grids, rail systems, everything had to be reconstructed. Governments couldn't do it alone. They needed companies with global reach, decades of experience, and the ability to scale fast. The same corporations that supplied the war now supplied the reconstruction. They built modern Europe, they rebuilt Japan, they connected continents, they created new materials, and they filled the gaps left by collapsed states. The war didn't destroy them, it made them indispensable. The transition from military to civilian dominance happened in 3 major waves. The first wave began immediately after the war, when industrial conglomerates shifted from producing aircraft engines and armored vehicles to producing cars, trucks, chemicals, and electronics. Factories, once dedicated to the war machine, now manufactured consumer goods for economies rising from the ashes. The skills were the same, the machinery was the same, the engineers were the same. Only the customers changed. In the second wave, during the Cold War, these companies became central to technological competition. The world needed advanced chemicals, computing systems, aerospace innovation, telecommunications, and precision manufacturing. The firms that had already mastered large-scale industrial production during wartime were perfectly positioned. They were not just survivors, they were the only ones ready for the next stage of global competition. The third wave began in the 1980 seconds and 90 seconds, when globalization exploded. The world opened its markets, finance became borderless, supply chains went international, and corporations with wartime roots used their decades-old networks to dominate entire sectors. They consolidated through mergers, acquisitions, strategic alliances, and international partnerships. Some grew into multinational titans with influence that rivaled governments. With every decade, their power expanded, and by the time we reached the 21st century, Many of the corporations that first rose to prominence in the 1930s had evolved into global giants, shaping everything from medicine to cars to energy infrastructure to banking systems. What makes this story even more fascinating and even more uncomfortable is how interconnected these companies became with governments. Once you become essential, governments don't regulate you, they rely on you. Modern states need pharmaceuticals, cars, aviation, industrial machinery, chemicals, research labs, and digital systems. And who provides them? The same firms whose ancestors supplied the war. Governments depend on them for employment, innovation, exports, military technology, and global influence. In return, corporations receive protection, subsidies, contracts, and political shielding. It's a symbiosis, not a conflict. This is why the post-war trials, investigations, and sanctions rarely resulted in permanent corporate destruction. Nations realized something deeply pragmatic. You can punish individuals, you can dissolve boards, you can restructure divisions, but you cannot afford to dismantle the industrial backbone of modern civilization. So instead of destroying them, the world rebuilt itself through them. This created a paradox. The corporations that once enabled the greatest conflict in human history became the corporations that built the post-war order, and today they remain the corporations that shaped the 21st century economy. They survived Hitler, they survived Allied prosecution, they survived Reconstruction. They survived the Cold War, the oil crises, the globalization boom, financial crashes, and technological upheavals. Their business empires expanded through every major historical turning point, absorbing new technologies, markets, and industries along the way. The war ended. Their influence didn't. Today, their fingerprints are everywhere in your medicine cabinet, in your car, in your electronics, in your bank, in your city's infrastructure, in your country's industrial strategy. They helped create the system we call the modern world. Global supply chains, mass production, standardized materials, chemical engineering, corporate governance, international patents, multinational logistics. This is why the story of World War II is not just history, it's the origin story of the global economy. And understanding it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How much power should corporations have? Can governments truly regulate the giants they depend on? What happens when a company becomes too important to challenge? What happens when global infrastructure is built not by nations, but by firms? And how much of today's world is still shaped by decisions made in an era defined by war? The answer is simple. More than we think. Much more. Because the corporations that survived Hitler didn't just survive. They won the long game. And they still rule the system we live under today.